looking at some weary eyes, but it's been good. It's been really good. I got a lot of numbers I want to shout at you at some time, but tonight's maybe not the night. But let me just say that Lads to Leaders is alive and strong. And because of that, the Lord's church is alive and strong. And what a blessing it is to be able to see that and to hear that and to be a part of that. And, you know, I meant to mention this Wednesday night, but I forgot it for whatever reason. So it was in the bulletin this morning. I don't know if you saw it or not, but Misty, I think we figured out how to collect money. We wait till the last Sunday. That's the way you do it. I don't know if you saw in the front of the bulletin or not, but last Sunday, there was over $820 given in one day, right? For 41 kids, that's 20 plus, right at $20 a piece, right? We had more kids this year to go, and there was more money per kid. So you can do the math and figure out that there was a lot more money given in one day. All that says to me is that you people understand the value of young people. You understand the value of our kids. You know, I was thinking about tonight, and just to be quite honest with you right out of the gate, I knew I'd be tired, so I didn't want to get real heavy tonight, so I'm not going to, okay? I was thinking about the value. Do you realize that if we sent all the young people home from the church, do you realize what would happen? Well, I got thinking about that this week. Maybe you've never thought about it. So here's the first thought that come to mind. I'd get my pew back. That's the first thought to come to mind. Maybe you've noticed a geographical shift going on up here in the front. There's only one reason for it. It's kids. We wouldn't need a nursery, would we? I mean, none of us adults are going to be changing any diapers, are we? On ourselves, or we don't need a cry room, do we? For that matter, I got to thinking, you know, we could just take out a bunch of classrooms, couldn't we? Not just the nursery. We could take out, what, 3/4 of the classrooms? Because we wouldn't need them. Then I got to thinking, you know what? Parents tend to go where their children go, don't they? We kind of do that as parents, don't we? And so where our children want to be and where they want to go, we kind of go. So I got to think, you know, if we took away the children, we might just lose quite a few parents. What do you think? I saw some grandparents this weekend that were pretty invested in their grandchildren, right? Think we might upset some grandparents if we just decided we wasn't going to have any young people in the church. I got to thinking about that this week a lot and kind of where we would be. Do you know where the church would be in a few years from now if it didn't have any young people? It'd be in a cemetery. That's where it'd be. It'd be in a cemetery. Because whether we like it or not, we're all mortal, right? And we're all getting older. And so if we really think about the value within the church, you know, to hear Wayne Scott tell how many tens of thousands of speeches have been given since last year Easter weekend throughout all the congregations that participate in Lads to Leaders. To hear him tell how almost 3,000 kids gave a speech on Saturday in 7 different locations. To hear about the tens of thousands of songs that have been led by boys and girls. Or to hear about the almost 3,000 songs that were led on Saturday. To think about where we stand in terms of our value within the church. I've had the opportunity recently to attend some generational type instructions, and I was in one of those generational meetings with some of the elders. I don't think all of them were in that particular lesson, but at least one or two of the elders were in that session with me a few Saturdays ago, and we learned how that for the first time ever in the history of the church, we have the most generations represented. There are 5 generations represented. And I'll pick on Brother Warren over here. So he would be in the oldest generation, and then Paxton would be in the youngest generation, right? And so Brother Warren is in one, Paxton's in another, and there's 3 more in between. So the first time ever. And what's happening is people's living longer, right? And that's okay, there's nothing wrong with that. But what it does is it creates some unique dynamics within the church, because where used to it was just a couple, maybe 3 at the most generations, now we have 5. We have 5 generations within the church. And so I sat through that lesson, and what I learned is that each generation thinks differently. And you got to figure out which generation you're in. And in that lesson I learned, Misty Killen, that there are things called, I don't even remember what they're called, but there are gaps where people fall into 2 different generations. See, I'm a millennial. Misty don't think Chastity and I think like millennials. So we're cuspards, maybe. Google that term and see if it's real. But anyway, there's a term by which a person who falls on the generational lines kind of associates with both generations. And so the millennials start the year Chastity and I were born, okay? And so we associate with both generations. We think a little bit like the previous generation and sometimes like them. The point is, there's a lot of different thought processes in the room tonight. That's the point. And really what I'm focused on is the bottom 2 or the youngest 2 generations to think about the value in the church. I don't know if anybody else gets it, but my friend Jimmy Dryden and I get it. It's called the Magnolia Messenger. It's a paper out of Mississippi that's done by some friends of my family's. Has been going on for decades now. Issue before last now, my friend Greg Ledbetter, some of you know as Fred, some of you know as Minivan, my college roommate wrote an article in that particular issue. And it was entitled Youth in the Church. And I began to read that article, and he began to make comments like, we're losing our youth, and our youth are having negative feelings toward the church. And as I began to read that, I thought, now Fred, you need to give us some meat here, okay? So he did. The next paragraph. He said that recently a Barna group did a study in the church, and 2 out of 3 young people are leaving the church between ages 18 to 22. 2 out of 3. He went on to say that in his over 10 years of experience of working with youth, that he has learned in a very real way that they make that decision long before they get 18. They're just not able to act on it until they're 18. Meaning, parents are forcing, if you will, or making, if you will, but come 18, I'm on my own, right? And so that's why you have such a huge dropout in the age range of 18 to 22. But in his mind, they're making that decision to leave the church much younger. And so he began to survey some young people, and I don't know how wide he went, but according to his article, he got 75 young people to respond to this survey. And what he wanted one question answered. What is the most discouraging thing in the church? Here were the top 3 answers. Number 1, feeling unwanted. Now let me be clear with all you right here, okay? I don't own anything in this church except that pew. And if I'm willing to give up my pew, what you need to know is I love you, okay? And you're wanted, all right? I can't imagine a church that would cause young people to feel like they're not wanted. And yet that was the number one answer in his survey. We don't feel like we're wanted. Answer number 2, according to his article or according to his survey, was we don't feel like we're needed. We don't feel like we're needed. I don't know what ages these are. I don't know how wide his spectrum was. He don't have 75 young people where he is the youth minister, so he had to go wider than that. But I just got to thinking, why is it that they don't feel like they're needed? I mean, if you could have saw some of the energy and the enthusiasm this weekend, let me tell you something. We need to tap into some of that. We need to figure out how to use. That is contagious. If you don't believe me, when church is over, watch one of them take off running. Guess what the other 7 will do? They'll take off running too. You don't believe me? Just watch it. Just watch it. It'll happen. It's contagious. Energy and enthusiasm is contagious. And these kids have got it. I don't know why we would want them to feel like they're not needed. Now they may be young, and there may be things that they can't do, and we've got to realize that and accept that, and so do they, and there are things that are adult things, and fair enough, but we got to figure out how to communicate that so that when they walk away, they're not saying, oh, they don't need us. That's the last thing we want them saying. The third reason, or third most common answer, I guess, would be the way to report that, was that we don't feel good enough. Now again, it's just 75 young people. I get it. There are thousands of young people in the church, but just take those 75 for what they're worth and just ask yourself, is that something that could be uniform across the young people in the Lord's church? We could poll our young people. They don't feel like they can be good enough. So then he asked a second question. He asked a follow-up question in his article. He said, what do you think causes that? You know what the number one answer was? It's on here, maybe. No? There it is. It's number one answer for what is causing discouragement among young people. Say, but now wait a minute. We've said that all of our lives, right? Here's the problem. If they're the church of the future, then why do you need them today? Here's the issue. If everything is built on what's coming, then what's my importance right now? Right? I think I understand what we mean, and I hope that I understand what I've meant in the past by saying the youth are the church of the future. But folks, we'd be crazy to not admit that they're a vital part of the church of today, aren't they? I have slept on a bed that did not sleep well. And I have gotten up earlier than I would have normally and stayed up, well, maybe not stayed up later, but I've stayed up late and my feet are weary. Why? Because young people are the church of today. Today, they matter now. They're important now. Their lives make a difference now in the church. As there coming a time when as adults later, Lord willing, They're gonna fulfill different roles within absolutely. Is there coming a time when some of us here that are older are thinking, if they don't stay faithful to the Lord, there won't be a church in the future? Absolutely. Those thoughts are all valid. But I'm telling you that these youngest two generations, they're looking for meaning and importance now. And if it's all about, well, y'all gonna be a great church in the future, then I'll just go somewhere else till the future. It's kind of the mentality. And unfortunately, young people check out. They're still here in body, but they check out spiritually. They check out mentally. And then when the time comes where they can physically, they begin to convince themselves that, you know what? If I'm not important to you right now, then I won't be here in the future, so it won't matter. I'm just telling you what my friend found in his research. And so then toward the end of the article, he began to say things like, you know, God's always used young people, hadn't he? I mean, even Saul tried to tell David, hey, you're just a boy, right? Can you see the king of Israel looking at this young boy saying, you know what? You are the leader of the nation of Israel in the future. Come back in 20 years and we'll put you to work. Can you imagine where David would have been 20 years later, 10 years later, 5 years later? One of my first sermons, David and Goliath. It was terrible. It was pathetic. But they let me preach it. And they listened. My point is, if we don't start them when they're young, they're not going to foster and grow and develop. David is obviously led by the Lord here, but look at Saul's rationale. Goliath, he's been fighting since he was a boy, and you're just a boy. David said, I can be valuable here. I can matter. I can make a difference. I sat in a room on Saturday morning. We've been doing this 8 years now. I've never sat in a room like this. I heard 11 boys give their speech. And I'm telling you that the guy that lost, he lost because he stuttered. There was no way to tell them apart. They were all quality, biblical, God-honoring, logical, very well presented. It's one of the hardest things I have ever done, is to try to pick a first, second, third. Those boys didn't get there last week. They've been working on this for years. They were in the 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And that wasn't their first speech. Oh, they've made dozens of speeches. My point is, we all got to start somewhere, don't we? Obviously, David had the Lord on his side, and he knew it. And he goes out and he wins the victory there. Joseph, can you imagine what's going on in a 17-year-old's mind when his brothers, of all people, turned their back on him? Can you imagine what a 17-year-old's thinking when they come up with this plan to lie to his father, to claim that he's dead, and they sell him off to this band of travelers? Can you imagine what's going through this teenager's mind? My daddy thinks I'm dead. My brothers hate me. I'm headed off to a foreign country. I will never see my family again. I'm as good as dead. I might as well just give up and throw in the towel. You know the rest of the story, right? God started using Joseph when he was a teenager, a boy. He grew to be a man, and he grew to be a great, faithful servant of God as a man. And he became an adult, and he showed some of the greatest power of forgiveness and love. All started when he was a boy. Could you imagine God saying to Joseph, well, yeah, I'd like to use you, but come back when you're older. Where would Joseph have been? Or I think about one more that my friend mentioned in his article, and it was Josiah. You might remember that he had a lot of counselors. He had a lot of advisors. And the reason why is, well, he was 8 years old when he began to reign. Who allowed him to begin to reign at 8 years old? God did. Who used him when he was a boy? God did. Who fashioned him and molded him into the leader and the king that he would become? A man who would walk in the ways of David. A man who would lead Israel in the ways of righteousness, at least try to. When did he start? At age 8. How early? How early is too early, right? Is there such thing as too early? You heard the Bible reading. Ryan read it very well, 1 Timothy 4 and verse 12. Do not let anyone look down on you. I don't know what translation this is, but probably you remember, as do I from our memory. Let no one despise you. Let no one despise you because you are young. Let no one look down on you because you are young. Why does that happen? Well, let's just admit what it is. Here it is, kiddos. You ready? Sometimes y'all act very immature. You are, okay? Did you hear that, adults? They are. They're immature. They're kids. Are you ready, kids? Let me tell you why some people despise you sometimes. Because you're annoying. Okay? Did you hear that, adults? They're annoying. They're kids. That's what kids do. That's what you did when you were a kid. The problem is some of you are too far removed from being a kid. You've forgotten what it was like. They're being kids because that's what kids do. And we can't expect kids to be mature adults. That's not who they are. I'm not suggesting that we can't expect them to behave. I'm not suggesting that we can't demand of them to be respectful. I'm simply saying that we have to acknowledge that kids are kids, and a lot of times they get looked down upon, and it's unfair to them. But now the next line, kids, look at what it says. But set an example for the believers. If you want to help the older people not despise you, you be an example worthy of being honored. Now, what that looks like at 5, 7, 8, 10, 12, 15, it all looks different. But the point is, you make it your goal to be the best 13-year-old that you can be. You aim to set an example in things like, Paul goes on to tell, in things like speech, in how you talk, in behavior, and how you conduct yourself. You conduct yourself in a way that sets an example to be respected in love, in faith, and in purity. I'm telling you, young people, tonight, I want you to hear me. What these older people think matters. It ought to matter. You ought to care. You ought to care enough to realize that they're trying to help you, to encourage you, to be a blessing to you. And so what they think ought to matter. And to the best of your ability, you ought to listen and take it to heart. To try to be the example that they're trying to help you be. Now you're going to be an 8-year-old, and that's all you can be. You can't be a 28-year-old. But what you can be is the best 8-year-old or 12-year-old, and be a good example. And listen to what the older generations are telling you to try to help you. But now let me draw two conclusions very fast, and then the lesson's yours. Right on the heels of that, let me say this. Are you listening, young people? What they think matters. And you ought to care enough to listen to the older generations. Now listen, we got 5 generations here, okay? So the first conclusion is this is not about adapting. And what I mean by that is Brother Warren thinks differently than Rodney. It's just a fact of generations. It's not that Rodney is terrible and Brother Warren's a saint or vice versa. It's the fact that he grew up in a different time, in a different generation, in a different culture than Rodney did. He thinks differently than I. He thinks about things differently than I do. And if it's wrong, it's wrong. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about things that become how you think to the point that you think it's right for everybody. And that is hurting the church. These kids don't think like us. They're a different generation. We can either accept that and embrace it and try to use it to mesh the family and make it stronger, or we can put our head in the sand and, well, they don't think like I do. Well, there's something wrong with them. Is it not the case that what is the priority here is God's standards? Is that not what this is about? And so when I see adapting, here's what I want to see us adapting to. I want to see us adapting to God's standards. Now, young people, if the way that Brother Warren thinks is right because it's the way God thinks, then I want to think like him. You understand? But if the way he thinks is because he was raised in a different time than you were, then what I'm asking all of us to admit is that we grew up in different cultures and different times and different settings. One of the greatest realizations is that in every generation there are what this lecturer called ghost stories. Meaning there are those key events in every generation that shaped and impact who you are. I'm picking on him and I don't have his permission. And I don't know this to be a fact. But what I do know is that a lot of people in Brother Warren's generation, they wash and reuse paper plates. Did y'all hear that? Paxton eats off of 2 paper plates every meal. It's a different way of thinking, okay? This guy lived through the Great Depression, you understand? They didn't have anything. They didn't know where their next meal was coming from. So when they get a paper plate, they keep a paper plate. All right? You guys grew up in a microwave generation where when it tears up, you throw it away and get another one, right? It's not a God standard. It's a mentality standard. And all of us have got to embrace that there are differences within the way we think, and don't try to get them to adapt to us. It won't work. This is not about adapting to one another. This is about understanding the standard of God and understanding when something is a righteous principle, it's good for every generation. And these young people need to get those righteous standards. And we need to make sure we're teaching them. What it may cause us to do is think a little differently than how we think as adults. And that's okay. I'm not asking you to adapt to them because that's not fair either. And the way they think. Many of you can't think like them. If you don't believe me, try to send out a group message to the church and ask people to sign up for alerts by texting 22300. It don't work for older people. You don't think like that. I didn't have a single person under the age of 30 have any problem with that. They just did it, right? That's the way we think. It's not the way you think. I get that. We're not asking for each other to change the way we think. It's not about, well, you got to take on my generation's mentality or else you can't. That's not going to work. It's hurting the church. We got to realize it is about God's standards. And whatever God says, here's what we want to be able to say. We want to be able to, like Samuel, say to the Lord, "Behold, I have obeyed your voice in all that you've said to me." As he's talking to Israel here, he says, now the king walks before you. And he was an old man at this point. But he says, I've walked before you. I've walked before God from my youth. We want this group to stay faithful. We want the 2 out of 3 to come from somewhere else. We'd like for that number to be less and to be 0 out of 3. But we can't affect everybody. We can influence this family. And so we want our percentages to be much lower than that. And we want to lose far less than that. In my mind, 1 is too many. We want adults to be able to say, I've walked with the Lord from the days of my youth all the way up. Or like the prophet Obadiah said in 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 12, I don't know where the Spirit of the Lord may carry you when I leave you. If I go and tell Ahab and he doesn't find you, he'll kill me. Yet I, your servant, notice what Obadiah said. I, your servant, have worshiped the Lord since my youth. That's the goal. It's not about adapting to anybody or any generation or any one set or way of thinking in terms of human age. It's about adjusting and modifying life to what it is that God is calling us, to the standards by which God is asking us to live. I give you one more. And here it is, parents. Done a lot of thinking about this over the last couple of weeks. I was a pretty good rule keeper growing up, you know. I knew how to keep the rules. I knew what the rules were, and I knew when the rules were enforced. And I also knew when the rules weren't. enforced. Kids are smart. They learn quickly. They learn what they can get away with or what they can get by with or how far they can push it. When the whole system is all about rule keeping. And guess what? When they become an adult, your rules don't matter anymore. If that's the entirety of the system, I'm not saying there ought not to be rules. There's got to be. There's got to be rules. I told a 97-page rule book with me all weekend long. I got a sore on my right shoulder from carrying that thing. Because there has to be some rules, right? We have to have something to go by so that we can know who's done it right and who hadn't. There has to be some guidelines. But if that's all it's about, so I'm kind of analyzing my style of parenting here. I'm trying to think, parents, is it just about rule keeping? Or is it about pleasing God? One of my favorite lines from every speech I've ever heard on modesty is this. It's not a hymn line, it's a heart line. Now you think about that. It's not a hymn line. It's not whether it's too high or too low or too short or too... It's a heart line. What is it I'm trying to do with my heart? That's the idea here. Am I keeping the rule just to say that I kept the rule? I mean, wow, go me. Or am I trying to do what's right because it's right, and I'm trying to follow the rules because I want to please God? See, rules are just hymn lines. And hymn line says, if it's got to be to the knee, then it's to the knee. Big whoopty, let's go. Heartline says, who might be influenced by it? Who might be discouraged because of it? God, please. I don't know what else to make of this. I don't have time to make a whole lot, but you remember when the rich young man came to Jesus? And all I've got on the screen is his answer, beginning in verse 20. He says, "Teacher, I have kept these things from my youth." But do you remember what happens just before this? He comes up to Jesus and he says, verse 17, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" I went into every college class and I had one question. What must I do to get an A? That's what I wanted to know. That's all I wanted to know. I didn't want a high A. I didn't want a perfect A. I wanted an A. Because here's what I learned. Come report card time, a low A paid the same as a high. I'm not telling you I like the mentality. I'm just illustrating with it. In other words, what must I do, right? To get to this grade level, what must I do? To make a 95, what must I do? This young man comes and says, "Jesus, what must I do?" Jesus' answer, keep the commandments. Oh, the commandments. You got some in mind? Yeah, like don't commit adultery, don't steal, honor your father and mother, don't murder. He gives him 4. Rule 1, rule 2, let's see. Okay, hadn't committed adultery. I think I'm honoring my father and mother pretty good. Hadn't murdered. Hadn't stolen anything. Pretty good, isn't it? And I'm doing well. That's what the young man says. I'm doing well. I've been doing all that since I was a young man. You see, if it's all about the rules, man, I got the rules there. I know what the rules are, and I'm keeping the rules. This story ought to have a good ending, but it don't. Why? Because Jesus says, I need your heart. Jesus says, young man, I need you to decide that you want to please God instead of just keeping the rules. And he says, now you're asking too much. I think it's great to raise a rule keeper. I think that's great. I think we need parents that'll raise rule keepers. But here's what I know about rule keepers. If they're not taught to be God pleasers, they'll stop keeping the rules at some point. The rules won't matter anymore at some point. And so then something else has got to take over. And in my mind, that's where the heart line comes in. Daddy's not going to always be standing there saying, child, that dress is too short. Macy Kate, look at that neckline. What do you think about that? I think it's too low. I ain't going to always be able to stand there and say that. I better hope that she's seeing some of that on her own. If we can help our young people to become God pleasers, man, the family can get vibrant very quickly. That's what it's all about, isn't it? Young or old alike. You're just here keeping the rules. You're here for the wrong reason. You need to be here because you want to please God. Are you a rule keeper or a God pleaser? Is it about the heart and what you can do to be a servant? If not, I plead with you to come as together we stand and sing.